Imagine being born into a life that the world assumes is guaranteed: wealth, power, influence, and a place in history simply because of your family name. Now imagine that very life being ripped away in an instant, not because of scandal, not because of crime, but because those who control the rules, your own family, decided you are no longer fit. That was the reality that Prince Harry faced. One moment, he was a royal with a clear path toward the throne. The next, he was sidelined, stripped of a future that had been promised to him at birth. And not just by anyone, by his father, King Charles, and 24 of Britain's most powerful dukes. The list that once included his name now excluded him entirely. The implications of this decision are enormous, and the drama behind it is deeper, darker, and more shocking than most could imagine. But before we dive into the story itself, let's pause for a moment. Think about it. How far would you go to protect your position in a family? And conversely, how far would betrayal cut when it comes from the people you were supposed to trust most? But before we continue, please subscribe and turn on the notification bell for updates. From the outside, royal life seems almost glamorous, a series of grand palaces, public adoration, and ceremonial pomp. But behind the scenes, centuries-old traditions intersect with very human emotions. Jealousy, rivalry, fear, and in Harry's case, profound heartbreak. By the time you reach the end of this story, you won't just see Prince Harry as a public figure or a celebrity duke. You'll understand the human being who fought, cried, and wrestled with questions that many of us will never have to face. Loyalty versus personal truth, duty versus self-preservation, and the staggering weight of being removed from a family legacy that you never asked to inherit but were born into. The shocking truth is that the event we're about to uncover didn't happen in isolation. It was the culmination of years of tension, secret conversations, whispered warnings, and invisible lines of power stretching across Buckingham Palace and beyond. We're not talking about a casual family dispute. We're talking about a calculated move by the monarchy itself. A carefully orchestrated act that involved 24 powerful dukes, advisors who have spent decades mastering the rules of succession, and a king who had to weigh love, duty, and the perception of the nation against his son. And at the center of it all was Harry, a man caught between the public eye and private heartbreak, struggling to process not just a personal loss, but a historic shift in the monarchy itself. Now, imagine sitting in the palace library, hearing the words that your name has been removed from the official line of succession. The walls are silent, the chandeliers glint in the soft light, and every photograph of past kings and queens seems to stare back at you. One wrong move, one misinterpreted comment, could define how history remembers you. And yet, the most intense pain isn't in the headlines. It's in the moment when you realize that the life you were born to live, planned, groomed, expected, is gone. How do you react? Do you fight? Do you cry? Do you disappear from public view entirely? Harry's reaction was all of these things and more, but the full story behind his tears is far more intricate, layered, and startling than anyone outside the palace could have predicted. And this is where the curiosity gap begins. Because the public narrative, the media coverage, the sound bites, the social media uproar, tells one story. It shows Harry walking away from the palace, Meghan by his side, and a general sense of drama. But the real story? The part that involves secret alliances, behind-the-scenes maneuvering, and centuries-old protocol bending under the weight of modern conflict, is something the world is only now beginning to understand. There are whispers that suggest not everyone in the palace agreed with this decision. There are rumors that some of the dukes who voted to remove Harry had personal grudges, secret bets, and hidden agendas. And, most shockingly, there are hints that even King Charles struggled profoundly with the decision, torn between his role as a father and his responsibilities as a monarch. So why does this story matter now? Because it's more than a royal scandal. It's a reflection of power, loyalty, and the human cost of tradition. Harry's removal from the succession list doesn't just affect him. It sends ripples through the entire monarchy, reshaping perceptions of authority, modernity, and the fragile balance between public duty and private emotion. Millions around the world watch, debate, and speculate, but few truly grasp what it means to have a legacy stripped away from you at the hands of those you love or once loved. And while headlines scream, Prince Harry removed, The deeper, more troubling narrative is one of heartbreak, strategy, and human vulnerability hidden behind centuries of crown and ceremony. By now, you might be asking yourself, what exactly happened? How did it come to this? Who are the dukes, and why did they wield such power over Harry's future? And most importantly, how did Harry himself process this moment, emotionally, psychologically, and spiritually? All of these questions will be answered in detail as we walk through the events that led to one of the most dramatic royal decisions in recent history. But first, let's set the stage for the story. The key players, the palace dynamics, and the silent battles that had been waged long before Harry's name was officially crossed off the list. We'll explore the secret meetings of 24 British dukes, whose votes and alliances are rarely disclosed to the public but carry immense weight in decisions of royal succession. We'll delve into King Charles's perspective, the pressures of living under centuries of precedent, and the moments where familial love collided with duty in ways that left scars on everyone involved. And we'll uncover Harry's journey, from the moment he first sensed tension brewing, to the heartbreaking instant when he realized his position was no longer secure, to the emotional fallout that continues to reverberate both inside the palace and in the public eye. Throughout this story, we'll mix the dramatic with the human. You'll see moments of anger, moments of despair, and moments of surprising levity, because even in the most harrowing circumstances, Harry's life has never been devoid of humor, wit, or resilience. You'll confront the stark contradictions of royal life, the glittering facade of the monarchy against the often painful realities of personal sacrifice and political calculation. And as we navigate these layers, you'll begin to understand why Harry's removal from the succession list is not just a news headline. It is a seismic event, one that reshapes the very definition of what it means to be royal in the 21st century. By the end of this introduction, one thing will be clear. This is a story about more than power, more than titles, and more than public appearances. It is a story about a man who was stripped of his future, a family torn between loyalty and ambition, and a monarchy forced to reconcile tradition with modern expectation. And yet, as dramatic as these events are, they are only the beginning. Behind the public announcements, the carefully worded press releases, and the global media coverage lies a series of events so intricate, so shocking, and so emotionally charged that they will redefine how we understand the monarchy and Harry's place within it. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. No warning, no conversation, just a letter. Imagine that. You're Prince Harry, a man born into a life of privilege and expectation, the world watching your every move, your every word analyzed, and suddenly, without preamble, you are told, officially, irrevocably, that your name has been removed from the line of succession. The shock isn't just personal, it's seismic. For centuries, the British monarchy has been guided by ritual, protocol, and an unbroken line of succession. And now, in an instant, all of that certainty, the security of being part of history, of carrying forward a legacy centuries in the making, has been taken from one man. The letter arrived quietly, almost anonymously, slipping through palace channels as if to spare Harry the spectacle. But there was no sparing him the impact. He opened it alone, in a private room where only the soft glow of chandelier light reflected on ornate furniture, where the portraits of long-dead kings and queens seemed to watch his every reaction. The words were concise, formal, and brutally cold. King Charles, with the approval of 24 British dukes, had officially removed him from the succession list. No explanation, no room for appeal, just a statement of fact that altered the trajectory of his entire life. The first reaction, of course, was disbelief. How could this happen? The monarchy, after all, is built on rules, on traditions so meticulously observed that even a whisper of deviation feels catastrophic. Yet here it was, happening to him, in real time. The sense of betrayal was immediate, piercing, and visceral. Harry was not just losing a title or an honor. He was losing a place in history, a place he had never asked for, but had been born into. The psychological weight of that loss is difficult to overstate. For anyone else, it might have been a devastating blow. For Harry, whose life had been so intensely scrutinized from birth, it was almost incomprehensible. In the moments following the letter, Harry's mind would have raced. He had always known there were tensions within the family, that protocol often collided with personal feelings, that the monarchy is as much about perception as it is about lineage. But never, in all his years growing up in the shadow of palaces, photographers, and ceremonial expectations, did he anticipate this kind of personal shock. The palace walls, normally a place of grandeur and ceremony, felt suddenly suffocating, almost oppressive. Every gilded frame and crystal chandelier became a reminder of a world he was now being quietly excluded from. This was not just a private matter. It was a public statement by one of the most powerful institutions in the world. And yet, unlike the tabloids and gossip columns that would later explode with speculation, this moment was painfully intimate. Harry was alone with the news, processing it internally before the world could even catch a hint of what was unfolding. The weight of expectation, the inevitability of public scrutiny, and the personal pain of family betrayal all collided in that instant. But why now? Why would King Charles, a man who had spent decades preparing to reign and navigating the delicate balance of fatherhood and monarchy, take such a drastic step? The reasons are complex, tangled in centuries of tradition, personal grievances, and political calculation. On one hand, Charles had to consider the integrity of the monarchy, the perception of the line of succession, and the precedent this decision would set. On the other hand, there were whispers of personal disputes, misunderstandings, and even old resentments that may have influenced his choice. Whatever the reasons, the effect on Harry was undeniable. He had been removed from a lineage that he was born to inhabit, stripped of the privileges and responsibilities that come with it, and left to confront the enormity of what had just occurred. The psychological impact of such a decision cannot be underestimated. For a man who has spent his life under scrutiny, whose every move has been dissected by media, historians, and the public, this moment was intensely isolating. The palace, for all its opulence, suddenly felt like a gilded cage. He was surrounded by history, but history had turned against him. He had access to the finest rooms, the most celebrated advisors, the most elaborate ceremonies, but none of that could cushion the emotional blow of being excluded from a future he was born to inherit. And yet, Harry did not react as the world might have expected. There were no public outbursts, no immediate confrontations, no sensational headlines issued by him personally. Instead, there was a quiet, private processing of grief, anger, and disbelief. It is in these moments that the human side of royalty is revealed, the side that rarely makes it into tabloids, that rarely reaches social media, but which is profoundly relatable. Imagine receiving news that your entire life path, your predetermined role in history, has been nullified. Most of us would crumble. Harry, though shaken, would soon have to navigate the next steps carefully, balancing emotion with the public scrutiny that has defined his life. What makes this moment even more intense is the involvement of the 24 dukes. These are not distant figures. They are powerful, influential members of the aristocracy, guardians of centuries-old traditions and power structures. They're unanimous, or near unanimous. Approval was what gave Charles the authority to act. This was not a unilateral family decision made in isolation. This was a calculated move, supported by the elite inner circle of the monarchy, designed to enforce a vision of succession that excluded Harry entirely. The involvement of these dukes added layers of political and emotional weight. Every vote, every whispered agreement, every nod in secret meetings was a reminder that this was more than a personal family conflict. It was a political act, steeped in history and consequence. Harry's reaction in the hours that followed was a mixture of private contemplation and discreet outreach. He understood, perhaps better than most, that any emotional outburst could be used as fodder by the media. He also knew that this moment was historically significant, a turning point not just for him, but for the monarchy itself. And so, he began the delicate process of grappling with his new reality. A future without the throne, a future where his place in history was suddenly uncertain, and a future that required him to redefine his identity outside of the parameters that had defined him since birth. The palace itself became a paradoxical space. On one hand, it was a place of safety, familiar routines, and protected chambers. On the other, It was a constant reminder of what had been taken away. Every corridor echoed with centuries of expectation. Every ceremonial room whispered of ancestors who had faced their own trials, yet none had experienced exactly this. A public stripping of succession in an era dominated by modern media scrutiny and global attention. The contrast between the personal pain Harry felt and the grandiose, ritualistic backdrop of the monarchy heightened the emotional tension. Even the public perception of this event was a delicate factor. The monarchy relies heavily on perception, how the world views its stability, its continuity, and its moral authority. Removing Harry from the succession list was not just an internal family decision. It was a message to the public that the monarchy could assert its authority, enforce its traditions, and maintain its structure, regardless of personal relationships. For Harry, this meant that his exclusion would be analyzed, debated, and critiqued around the world, compounding the personal anguish with global scrutiny. And then there was the question of the emotional toll. Harry had spent years navigating complex family dynamics, managing media narratives, and trying to find his place within a system that often seemed indifferent to personal happiness. The moment of removal was a culmination of all of those pressures. It was not a single event in isolation, but the apex of years of tension, miscommunication, and unspoken grievances. The letter, concise and formal as it was, symbolized much more than a bureaucratic decision. It was a crystallization of a lifetime of expectations, disappointments, and unspoken conflicts coming to a head. As Harry absorbed the weight of the decision, he was faced with immediate questions. How would this affect his public role? How would the world perceive him? What would become of his family, his wife, and his children? And, perhaps most importantly, how could he redefine his life after such a profound shift? These were questions without immediate answers, each one carrying emotional, social, and historical ramifications that would unfold over months and years. But before any of that could happen, there was the private, human side of the shock, a man confronting the sudden, undeniable truth that his place in a centuries-old lineage had been revoked. The isolation, the fear, the heartbreak were profound. The moment was a stark reminder that behind every royal title is a human being capable of experiencing pain, betrayal, and profound loss. And while the world would soon know of this exclusion, they could never fully grasp the quiet, intense turmoil Harry experienced in that room, under the watchful gaze of history and tradition. Yet this is only the beginning. The initial shock is just the first layer of a story filled with intrigue, family tension, political maneuvering, and personal resilience. Behind the closed doors of Buckingham Palace, meetings were convened, alliances tested, and strategies debated, all with Harry's fate at the center. The drama that followed would not only shape Harry's life, but would send shockwaves through the monarchy, the media, and public perception around the globe. And so, as the initial waves of disbelief and heartbreak subsided, a new reality emerged. Harry was no longer just a prince. He was a man forced to confront the extraordinary challenge of redefining his identity, his purpose, and his place in history, all while the world watched. Every decision, every reaction, every word spoken from that moment forward carried monumental weight. And the question that loomed over him, silent yet unyielding, was this: what would he do next? But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. 24 dukes. One vote. One decision that would change the course of a royal's life, and the monarchy itself. Imagine a room steeped in centuries of tradition, walls lined with portraits of ancestors whose eyes seemed to judge every word spoken, and a table heavy with the weight of history. In this room, powerful men, guardians of centuries-old privilege, wealth, and influence, convened in secrecy. Their purpose? To determine whether Prince Harry would remain part of the British line of succession or be removed entirely. The meeting itself was not public, not even whispered about in the corridors of Buckingham Palace, and yet its consequences were monumental. To understand the gravity of this gathering, we have to understand who these dukes are. They are not merely ceremonial figures. They wield extraordinary social, political, and cultural influence. Some oversee vast estates. Others hold titles dating back to the Norman conquest. Each of them has a vested interest in the continuity and perception of the monarchy. For centuries, the dukes have acted as advisors, enforcers, and occasionally, as power brokers within the royal ecosystem. Their approval is not ceremonial, it is decisive. And in this case, their combined authority gave King Charles the ability to formalize the removal of his son from the succession list with both legal and symbolic weight. The room itself was austere yet intimidating, lined with dark wood panels, heavy curtains, and ancestral portraits that seemed to watch the proceedings. Every seat around the table carried significance. Senior dukes who had decades of influence in the House of Lords took positions of authority, their every gesture carefully considered. Junior dukes, eager to assert themselves and ensure their perspectives were counted, watched and waited for moments to intervene. Outside, staff moved silently, aware that the decisions being made inside could alter the monarchy for generations. The atmosphere was thick with tension. Every word spoken had the potential to shift the balance of power. But the decision wasn't straightforward. Removing a prince from the line of succession is not a casual act. It required not just agreement, but alignment with centuries of precedent, legal authority, and moral justification. Some dukes argued passionately against the move. They questioned whether Harry's actions, or his public stance on the monarchy, justified such a radical step. "He's a son," one duke reportedly said, "and a member of a family whose traditions are meant to endure. Is personal dissatisfaction enough to justify removing him?" Others countered that Harry's public criticisms, his break from royal duties, and the global attention his personal life had garnered were destabilizing forces that the monarchy could no longer ignore. And then there were whispers, soft but persistent, that personal grievances colored some votes. Rivalries, long-standing disagreements, and even subtle resentments influenced the discussions. The dukes are human, after all, and power structures are rarely immune to ego. Some had been slighted by Harry in the past. Others felt he had undermined the monarchy's public image. Every gesture, every raised eyebrow, every deliberate pause in conversation carried meaning. The decision, though presented as formal, was anything but simple. It was a tangled web of tradition, politics, and deeply personal emotion. The discussion was meticulous. Votes were not cast hastily. Legal advisors reminded the dukes of the implications. Historians noted precedents and potential consequences, and the atmosphere grew heavier with every passing hour. There were debates over the wording of official statements, the order in which the announcement would be made, and even how Harry's title should be handled post-removal. Every detail was examined through the lens of centuries of royal tradition. It was not just about Harry. It was about setting a precedent for how the monarchy would handle dissent, independence, and public criticism in an era when global media scrutiny is relentless. Amidst this deliberation, one thing became painfully clear. The dukes were not a monolith. Alliances formed and dissolved with every objection, every concession, every subtle gesture. Some were staunchly loyal to the king and viewed Harry as a threat to stability. Others, more sympathetic to the younger prince, argued for a measured approach, suggesting private negotiations rather than public exclusion. The tension between loyalty, justice, and perception was palpable, and the room became a battlefield of ideology, tradition, and personal interest. Meanwhile, King Charles, though not always physically present, loomed over the proceedings like a specter. His guidance, often nuanced and cautious, shaped the tenor of the discussion. He understood the weight of history, the responsibility of his position, and the delicate balance between being a father and being a king. At moments, he had to suppress emotion, knowing that any overt favoritism could tilt the delicate equilibrium in the room. At other times, his authority reminded the dukes of the stakes. This was not merely a family matter. This was an institution asserting its stability, its rules, and its long-term vision. Perhaps the most intense moments came when discussion turned to Harry himself. How would he react? What would be the global perception? Would the media spin this as a scandal or as a necessary step for the monarchy's survival? The dukes debated not just the morality of the action, but its optics. Some argued that excluding Harry publicly would appear cruel. Others contended that secrecy was impossible. Once one media outlet discovered the story, it would spread globally within hours. Every word, every decision, carried consequences far beyond the walls of the room. Amidst all this, one unexpected factor emerged: the influence of Meghan Markle. While she was not present, her impact was undeniable. Her public presence, her advocacy for Harry, and her global popularity complicated the conversation. Dukes debated whether Harry's decisions had been influenced too heavily by Meghan, and whether her involvement should factor into the decision. It is a remarkable illustration of how modern realities, media, celebrity, and public perception, clash with centuries-old institutions. For the Dukes, a decision about succession was no longer just about bloodlines. It was about optics, narrative control, and influence in a 24/7 media world. Finally, after hours of deliberation, votes were cast. The procedure, formal and exacting, involved tallying opinions, considering dissenting voices, and weighing the long-term consequences. And then, in a moment of historic finality, the decision was made. Prince Harry would be removed from the line of succession. It was a verdict that combined tradition with political calculation, authority with emotion, and public responsibility with private grief. The room was silent after the announcement. Some dukes nodded solemnly, satisfied that the monarchy's authority had been preserved. Others sat quietly, a mixture of regret and apprehension etched into their expressions. They had exercised their power, upheld centuries of precedent, and ensured the stability of the line of succession. But they had also, in a single decision, profoundly altered the life of a young prince, and sent ripples of shock and emotion that would reach around the world. For Harry, the consequences of this meeting would be devastating. The votes, the discussions, and the deliberations of 24 powerful dukes, carried out in secrecy, away from public view, would result in a life-changing moment that he could not ignore. It was more than a procedural decision. It was a deeply personal, emotional, and symbolic act. The secrecy of the meeting added to the pain. While the world might see Harry walking away, few could grasp the intricate network of power and influence that led to this moment, or the calculated discussions that sealed his fate. And yet, while the decision had been made, the story was far from over. The Duke's votes were just the beginning of a chain reaction. Media speculation, public perception, and Harry's personal response would all collide in the days and weeks to follow. Every decision made in that room would echo through history, shaping not just Harry's path, but the trajectory of the monarchy itself. The private act of a secret vote had global consequences, a stark reminder that power, even in the most controlled institutions, is never without consequence. And in the midst of all this, one question remained unanswered. Why did some dukes vote the way they did? Was it loyalty, resentment, pragmatism, or something more personal? The answer is murky, hidden behind decades of tradition and layers of secrecy, but it is critical to understanding the full story. Because while Harry would have to face the public consequences, the private motivations of these powerful men reveal the deeper forces at work, a mix of power, ambition, and human complexity that few outside the room could ever comprehend. And so, the stage was set. Harry had been removed from the line of succession, but the story was only beginning. The dukes had voted, King Charles had sanctioned the decision, and the machinery of monarchy had set its course. But the personal, emotional, and public fallout had yet to unfold. And as Harry would soon discover, the consequences of this secret meeting would stretch far beyond the palace walls, touching every aspect of his life, and challenging the very notion of what it means to be a prince in the modern world. But what Harry didn't yet know, what no one outside that room could predict, was that the repercussions of this vote would ignite a storm, one that would test loyalty, expose hidden alliances, and reveal shocking betrayals in ways that would leave the monarchy and the world reeling. The world knows Prince Harry as a prince. To millions, he is the cheeky royal, the adventurous Duke of Sussex, the man who stepped into the spotlight with charm, confidence, and a rebellious streak that both delighted and infuriated the British public. He is the prince who smiled at cameras, rode alongside soldiers, and walked in front of cheering crowds. He is the man whose every gesture, every word, and every glance has been scrutinized, dissected, and broadcast globally. But the Harry the public sees is only half the story. The other half, the private Harry, is rarely glimpsed, and even more rarely understood. And it is this private Harry, the man behind the crown, who would be most profoundly affected when his life, legacy, and place in the monarchy were suddenly upended. Imagine for a moment the pressure of living a life in constant observation. Every action is catalogued, every emotion analyzed, every choice judged. For Harry, even mundane decisions carried extraordinary weight. A casual trip abroad could become international news. A joke or expression caught by paparazzi could spark global debate. And yet, he was also a son, a brother, a husband, and a father, roles that exist outside the public gaze but are no less demanding. The tension between who he was expected to be and who he truly was created an internal friction that few outsiders could ever fully comprehend. The public Harry was trained, consciously or unconsciously, to navigate protocol with poise. From an early age, he learned to smile when cameras flashed, to shake hands with politicians, to appear confident in ceremonial dress and military uniform. He embodied the image of a prince, a figurehead, a representative of the monarchy to the world. And yet, beneath the smiles, behind the carefully curated appearances, was a man struggling with expectations he had never fully consented to. The private Harry was more complex, more vulnerable, and more human than any headline could capture. When the letter arrived, the dichotomy between these two versions of Harry became stark. The public Harry, the composed, confident figure, could not simply react impulsively. The world was watching, and any public display of grief or anger would be magnified, dissected, and potentially weaponized by the press. The private Harry, on the other hand, was reeling. Shock, disbelief, and profound sadness crashed over him in waves. It was a moment of intense vulnerability, a confrontation with personal loss that no public smile could mask. In the quiet of his private quarters, he allowed himself to process the emotional fallout. The solitude was both a relief and a torment, a chance to feel the pain fully and yet a reminder that he was alone with it. This contrast between public and private Harry is crucial to understanding his reaction. Publicly, he continued to perform his duties as best he could, attending events, meeting dignitaries, and maintaining appearances. Privately, he wrestled with profound questions. How had he been excluded so suddenly? Why had the people closest to him, including his father and powerful dukes, allowed this to happen? What did this mean for his role within the monarchy, and more importantly, for his sense of self? These questions were deeply personal, and the answers were far from simple. The media, of course, was quick to interpret Harry's public behavior. Every meeting, every smile, every press appearance was scrutinized for signs of distress, anger, or defiance. Headlines alternated between praise for his resilience and speculation about family conflict. Social media erupted with opinions, some sympathetic, others scathing. Yet none of this could capture the private reality. A man grieving the loss of his expected future, feeling the sting of familial betrayal, and questioning where he truly belonged. Harry's private life also intersected with his public role in ways that complicated the narrative. He had grown accustomed to balancing appearances with authenticity, managing public perception while trying to maintain personal integrity. But this situation, the removal from succession, was unprecedented. There was no manual, no precedent, no way to navigate the emotional and political consequences simultaneously. He could not simply disappear, nor could he openly rebel without causing a constitutional stir. The tension between visibility and invisibility, between obligation and personal need, created an emotional pressure cooker. And then there was Meghan. Her presence, both public and private, was a constant factor. Publicly, she supported Harry with poise, charm, and a careful strategy of engagement. Privately, she provided emotional sustenance, advocacy, and an unwavering shield against the pressures of palace life. Together, they navigated the collision of public scrutiny and private grief. Yet even with her support, the weight of exclusion from the line of succession was enormous. It forced Harry to reconcile his identity as a prince with his identity as a husband, a father, and a man seeking autonomy. What makes this dichotomy particularly striking is how differently the world interprets the two halves of Harry. Publicly, he is often portrayed as defiant, even reckless, by those who do not understand the complexity of his private struggles. Privately, he is thoughtful, reflective, and emotionally vulnerable. This tension is not a weakness. It is the hallmark of a man grappling with unprecedented circumstances, forced to balance centuries of expectation with his personal truth. The private-public divide also shaped Harry's response to the removal from succession. In private, he allowed himself to grieve, to cry, and to feel the weight of loss. He spoke to confidants, reflecting on the betrayal he felt and the future he no longer had a guaranteed claim to. He processed anger at the system, sadness over the familial rift, and anxiety about the unknown path ahead. In public, however, he maintained composure, aware that any misstep could reinforce narratives he wanted to challenge. The duality required constant vigilance, emotional control, and resilience. This contrast is amplified when considering Harry's past experiences. From childhood, he had learned the price of visibility. He understood that private moments could become public spectacle in seconds. He had endured tabloid scrutiny, paparazzi invasions, and the persistent shadow of tragedy following his mother's death. Each of these experiences had honed his awareness of the stakes of public perception, and now, with his position in the monarchy threatened, that awareness became both a tool and a burden. Audience, consider this. How would you navigate such a duality? To live a life where every gesture is both real and performative, where your private grief must be hidden behind a public smile, where your very identity is contested, both by the institution you were born into and by a global audience eager to interpret every nuance. Harry faced this reality daily, and the emotional strain was relentless. Yet, even in this struggle, he demonstrated resilience, humor, and the ability to adapt, traits that would define his response to the challenges ahead. Despite the immense pressure, Private Harry also began planning. He understood that in order to survive and thrive outside the immediate confines of succession, he would need to carve out a new identity, one that honored his personal values while navigating the expectations of public life. This planning was strategic, emotional, and deeply personal. It involved reflection, consultation with advisors, and an honest reckoning with what he wanted for himself and his family. The path forward was uncertain, fraught with risk, and yet filled with the potential for reinvention. And yet, for all this reflection and planning, the public and private divide remained unresolved. Publicly, the world could only see his composure and occasional appearances. Privately, he grappled with profound questions about loyalty, betrayal, identity, and legacy. The gap between perception and reality widened daily, creating tension not just within Harry himself, but across the monarchy and the media. This tension would soon manifest in ways no one could fully anticipate. Private frustrations would clash with public responsibilities. Hidden alliances and secrets would be revealed. And Harry's choices, shaped by this duality, would have consequences that rippled far beyond the walls of the palace. He had to reconcile these two selves, finding a way to live authentically while managing the gaze of the world, the expectations of his family, and the pressures of tradition. But perhaps the most poignant aspect of this duality was the emotional toll. Private Harry's grief was real, raw, and human. Public Harry's smile, handshake, and ceremonial gestures were armor, shielding him from the world but not from the pain within. This dichotomy highlights the extraordinary challenge of being a modern royal, to navigate the expectations of centuries-old institutions while maintaining a personal life, identity, and sense of purpose. It is a balancing act few could manage, and one that Harry confronted with courage, even as the walls of tradition closed in around him. And yet, despite his efforts, the world would soon witness moments when private emotion collided with public duty. Moments of vulnerability, defiance, and revelation that would shock audiences, spark debate, and challenge long-held perceptions of the monarchy. The tension between public and private Harry was far from resolved, and the consequences of this struggle would become increasingly visible in the events that followed. Because the truth is, while Harry's public persona might have suggested control, confidence, and calm, the private reality was far more complicated. Every decision, every meeting, every interaction carried weight, not just for him, but for the monarchy, the media, and the millions watching around the world. And as the days and weeks unfolded, The delicate balance between these two selves would be tested in ways that would forever alter Harry's life, the monarchy, and public perception alike. But what Harry didn't yet know, and what the public would only gradually come to realize, was that this duality would be the crucible in which his future, his identity, and his understanding of loyalty and family would be forged. And the next chapter of this story would reveal how far the palace and its secretive power structures were willing to go to enforce the decision made by the dukes, and the consequences that awaited Harry in the days to follow. But what came next would test Harry in ways he never expected, and would reveal truths about the monarchy that shocked even those closest to the crown. No family is perfect. Even the most revered, gilded, and historically significant family in the world is not immune to conflict. But for Prince Harry, the rupture that followed his removal from the line of succession was unlike anything he, or anyone, could have imagined. Behind the closed doors of palaces, private estates, and discreet chambers, tensions that had been simmering for years suddenly erupted, exposing raw emotions, fractured loyalties, and unresolved grievances that had long been buried beneath the surface of royal protocol. The shock of Harry's exclusion reverberated immediately within the family. King Charles, having sanctioned the removal with the backing of the 24 dukes, faced a storm of private turmoil. As a father, he was torn between the responsibilities of monarchy and the love he felt for his son. The corridors of Buckingham Palace, usually lined with portraits of stoic monarchs, suddenly seemed to echo with unspoken words of guilt, anger, and sorrow. Charles had made a decision he believed was necessary for the stability of the monarchy, but he also knew that no justification could erase the personal hurt inflicted on his son. And Harry, as anyone would, felt the sting of rejection most acutely from the man who was meant to be his protector. The impact on other family members was equally intense. Prince William, Harry's elder brother and heir to the throne, found himself caught in a delicate balancing act. He had to navigate loyalty to his father, concern for his brother, and the pressures of public expectation. The relationship between the brothers, once close and marked by camaraderie, was strained as private disagreements over protocol, personal decisions, and public behavior came to light. Each conversation became a negotiation of loyalty versus authenticity, and every glance carried the weight of unspoken judgment. The extended royal family was also thrown into turmoil. Cousins, uncles, aunts, and senior advisors, many of whom had long histories with both Harry and Charles, found themselves taking sides, subtly or overtly, in ways that intensified emotional strain. Alliances that had existed for decades were tested, sometimes fractured, and occasionally reinforced. The palace became a microcosm of political maneuvering and emotional negotiation, where every word, every gesture, and every choice carried consequences not just for individuals, but for the institution itself. The media, of course, amplified every crack in the family's facade. Leaks, rumors, and speculation transformed private tensions into public spectacle almost overnight. Reports hinted at arguments behind closed doors, whispered warnings from advisors, and disagreements between senior family members over how to handle Harry's reaction. While some stories were exaggerated, others were disturbingly accurate, reflecting the true depth of division and tension that had erupted in the wake of Harry's removal. For Harry, the emotional impact was profound. He had anticipated some level of disapproval, even resentment, from his father and the dukes, but the intensity and immediacy of familial tension were staggering. Private conversations that had once been comforting or supportive were now tinged with judgment, hesitation, and unspoken critique. Moments that might have been lighthearted, family dinners, walks through palace gardens, ceremonial engagements, were now fraught with caution and undercurrents of unease. Every interaction became a delicate dance, balancing the need to assert personal identity with the desire to maintain relationships that had once been deeply meaningful. Meghan's presence added another layer of complexity. As both a shield and a partner, she offered emotional support and counsel. But her involvement also introduced new dynamics into an already tense family structure. Some family members viewed her influence as positive, others as threatening. The intersection of public perception, personal loyalty, and private emotion created a perfect storm in which every action was scrutinized and every decision carried amplified significance. Harry's relationship with Meghan became both a source of strength and a point of contention, highlighting the deeply human struggles that even royals face behind gilded walls. One particularly intense period occurred during a private family meeting convened shortly after the removal decision. Accounts suggest that emotions ran high, voices were raised, and some long-simmering grievances came to the surface. Arguments over protocol, duty, and loyalty were intertwined with raw emotional appeals about family, love, and fairness. For Harry, it was a moment that crystallized everything he had been feeling in private: a sense of betrayal, frustration at lack of understanding, and anguish at being excluded from a legacy he had never chosen but had expected to inherit. And yet, despite the intensity of these confrontations, Harry's response was measured in public. He understood that emotional outbursts would provide fodder for critics and reinforce narratives he wanted to challenge. But in private, he allowed himself to feel the full weight of family tension: anger at perceived betrayals, sadness over fractured bonds, and anxiety about the uncertain path ahead. These private emotions, while invisible to the world, shaped his decisions, interactions, and eventual strategies for reclaiming personal agency. The tension also revealed fractures in communication. Advisors, aides, and senior family members often had competing perspectives, which created confusion and conflict. Messages were misinterpreted, intentions questioned, and alliances tested. The result was a web of miscommunication that magnified emotional strain and made resolution even more difficult. Harry, caught in the center, had to navigate both the substance of his removal and the chaos of human reaction, a dual challenge that tested his patience, resilience, and emotional intelligence. Another critical element of this familial tension was the interplay between duty and identity. Royals are conditioned from birth to prioritize the institution over personal desire, to accept protocol as immutable, and to embody tradition in ways that often suppress individuality. Harry, however, had always struggled with these constraints, seeking autonomy while still honoring his responsibilities. His removal from succession forced him to confront these conflicting values head-on. The resulting tension was both internal and external. A struggle to reconcile personal authenticity with familial expectation, and a challenge to navigate relationships that were suddenly charged with conflict, disappointment, and unspoken judgment. Audience, imagine being in Harry's shoes. Your family, once a source of security, becomes a source of tension. Every word, every gesture, every interaction is laden with stakes you cannot fully control. Those closest to you, including your father and brother, are now embroiled in conflict over your very future. How do you maintain composure, assert identity, and navigate loyalty, all while being observed by the world? Harry faced this challenge daily, and the emotional toll was immense. It's also worth noting that these tensions had ripple effects beyond the immediate family. Staff, advisors, and palace personnel found themselves navigating delicate loyalties, unsure of whom to support, how to act, and how to maintain discretion. Leaks to the press were inevitable, whether intentional or accidental, and each news story fed the cycle of tension, speculation, and emotional stress. The palace ecosystem itself became a pressure cooker, amplifying every familial conflict and placing additional strain on Harry and those closest to him. Perhaps most painfully, the explosion of family tension forced Harry to confront profound questions about trust, loyalty, and love. How much could he rely on those who had guided and shaped his life? Who could he confide in? And, ultimately, how could he protect himself and his family from the fallout of decisions made by others, no matter how historically or institutionally justified? These questions were not abstract. They were intensely personal, and they shaped the trajectory of his actions in the weeks, months, and years to come. The culmination of this period of tension was a private confrontation that, according to reports, left Harry emotionally shaken. Words were exchanged, tears were shed, and old wounds reopened. It was a reminder that even in the most privileged of families, the human experience of betrayal, disappointment, and heartbreak is universal. Titles and institutions cannot shield anyone from these emotions, and the monarchy, for all its history and grandeur, was no exception. And yet, amidst this storm of family tension, Harry began to lay the groundwork for the next phase of his life. He recognized that resolution within the family might not be immediate or complete, and that personal agency would be essential for both his well-being and that of his loved ones. He started thinking strategically: how to communicate with the public, how to protect his family, and how to assert his identity in a system that had suddenly marginalized him. The family feud was painful, but it also became a catalyst for transformation. Because as intense and heartbreaking as the familial conflicts were, they were only the beginning. The private fallout of Harry's removal would set off a chain reaction that reached beyond family walls, touching global media, public perception, and the very institution of the monarchy. What began as a letter and a secret vote had escalated into an emotional battlefield, and Harry was now standing in the center, forced to navigate both love and betrayal, tradition and autonomy, loyalty and self-preservation. But what came next would push family tensions to a breaking point and reveal truths about the palace, the dukes, and even King Charles that no one outside the inner circle could have anticipated. The removal from succession wasn't just a procedural decision, it was a seismic emotional blow. For Prince Harry, the aftermath was not about protocol or tradition. It was about grief, anger, confusion, and a profound sense of loss. Imagine, for a moment, the weight of realizing that your place in history, your expected role in a centuries-old institution, and your public identity had been stripped from you almost overnight. The initial shock may fade, but the emotional fallout lingers, deep and heavy, like the cold echo in the grand halls of a palace that suddenly feels more like a cage than a home. In the days following the official removal, Harry faced an onslaught of emotions. There was disbelief at the finality of the decision. He had always known that tensions existed, that disagreements simmered beneath polite appearances, but the permanence of exclusion hit harder than any of the whispers or warnings could have prepared him for. There was anger, directed both outward and inward, at his father, at the dukes, at the institution, and even at himself for hoping that familial bonds might protect him. There was grief, a deep mourning for the life, the responsibilities, and the historical legacy that had been taken from him. And there was fear, fear of the unknown, fear of public perception, fear of a future that now had no clear path. These emotions were compounded by Harry's unique position in the modern world. Unlike princes of centuries past, he lived under the relentless gaze of global media, social networks, and an audience that measured every reaction. There was no room for quiet grieving, no private space free from scrutiny. Every facial expression, every gesture, every whisper of emotion could be captured, analyzed, and broadcast worldwide. The pressure to maintain composure while processing profound personal loss created an emotional strain almost impossible to quantify. Yet Harry did what many of us do in moments of crisis. He sought solace in those closest to him. Meghan was at his side, offering emotional support, counsel, and reassurance. She provided a buffer against the institutional machinery that had marginalized him, a safe space where vulnerability could exist without immediate judgment. And yet, even within that safe space, the intensity of the moment could not be fully contained. Private conversations became cathartic outlets, spaces to articulate anger, frustration, and grief, but they also highlighted the profound isolation of someone whose life is lived in both public and private extremes. Audience, pause and consider this. How would you process the realization that your life path, determined from birth and reinforced for decades, had been altered against your will? How do you reconcile the loss of expectation with the need to forge a new identity? For Harry, these were not hypothetical questions. They were daily challenges that shaped his emotional, psychological, and social reality. The fallout also manifested in sleepless nights and reflective solitude. Harry reportedly spent long hours walking palace corridors, reflecting on his life, his choices, and the events that led to this point. He revisited memories from childhood, moments of joy, insecurity, and love, through the lens of betrayal. Each recollection carried a new weight, reframed by the knowledge that his place in succession had been revoked. The combination of nostalgia, regret, and anger created a complex emotional landscape that demanded resilience, introspection, and, eventually, action. Friends and confidants noted subtle changes. Harry, who had always been approachable and open, became more guarded, more introspective, and more deliberate in his communications. He wrestled with questions of trust. Who could he confide in, and who might use his vulnerability against him? The palace, which had once been a place of routine and ceremony, now felt suffocating, a constant reminder of exclusion and institutional authority. The contrast between personal turmoil and public expectation became a defining feature of this period in his life. But Harry also demonstrated remarkable emotional intelligence during this fallout. Rather than succumbing entirely to despair, he began to process his grief strategically. He sought guidance from mentors, friends, and advisors outside the palace who could provide perspective, validation, and alternative viewpoints. He recognized the need to separate emotion from action, grief from decision-making. And yet, even as he strategized, the emotional undercurrent remained, influencing his choices, interactions, and eventual path forward. This emotional turbulence also intersected with family relationships. Tensions with King Charles and Prince William remained unresolved, and the strain of exclusion intensified these fractures. Conversations that had once been casual or supportive were now colored by judgment, misunderstanding, and emotional residue. Every interaction, however brief, became a negotiation of loyalty, trust, and self-protection. The personal cost of exclusion was magnified not just by loss of succession, but by the rupture in family dynamics that had defined Harry's life since childhood. Compounding the emotional fallout was the weight of public expectation. The world expected composure, dignity, and strategic restraint. Fans, critics, media outlets, and royal commentators all weighed in, offering opinions on whether Harry should respond publicly, remain silent, or even reconcile with his family. This external pressure added a layer of complexity to an already emotionally fraught situation. Harry had to navigate not only personal grief but also global scrutiny, balancing authenticity with the need to maintain a public persona that could withstand intense examination. Interestingly, the fallout also revealed Harry's resilience. Emotional pain, though profound, became a catalyst for growth. He began to articulate boundaries, establish priorities, and define his own values independent of royal expectation. The removal from succession, while deeply painful, forced Harry to confront who he was, what he wanted, and how he could exert agency in a system that had long dictated the terms of his existence. In essence, his emotional fallout became the crucible for personal transformation. Yet the process was not linear. Grief, anger, and fear ebbed and flowed unpredictably. One day brought clarity and resolve. The next brought doubt and emotional vulnerability. Even as Harry strategized for the future, he had to manage intense emotional swings, reconcile competing desires, and confront the existential question of identity outside of succession. The human experience of loss, amplified by centuries of expectation and global visibility, created a psychological landscape both intricate and perilous. And then there were moments of raw vulnerability. Close friends and advisors recount seeing Harry in private moments of profound sorrow, tears shedding not just for himself, but for the rupture in family bonds, the betrayal by institutions he had trusted, and the sudden fragility of roles he had assumed were immutable. These moments of vulnerability, though private, underscore the deeply human dimension of a situation often portrayed in headlines as mere political maneuvering. Harry's experience reminds the world that even the most privileged lives are not immune to heartbreak, betrayal, and profound emotional turbulence. Audience, ask yourself, how would you navigate such intense emotional fallout while being observed by the entire world? Could you balance grief, strategy, family dynamics, and public expectation all at once? Harry's experience illustrates the extraordinary pressure of combining private loss with public responsibility, a duality that few outside royal circles can fully comprehend. The emotional fallout also influenced Harry's subsequent decisions. He began to consider his options for personal agency, public voice, and family protection. He weighed the consequences of public statements, contemplated private negotiations, and started planning ways to redefine his role in the world beyond the monarchy. The emotional turmoil, paradoxically, became both a constraint and a catalyst, guiding him toward actions that would reshape not only his life, but the public's perception of royalty itself. And yet, despite the clarity that began to emerge, the fallout remained unpredictable. The intersection of emotion, family tension, institutional authority, and public scrutiny created an environment in which every decision carried immense weight. Harry's emotional state was both a vulnerability and a source of insight, a lens through which he could navigate the complex web of expectation, tradition, and personal aspiration. But what made this period particularly volatile was that the fallout was far from over. The immediate emotional shock was only the first layer. It would ripple outward, affecting relationships, public narratives, and even the monarchy's global image. Harry's private grief was about to collide with external forces in ways that would test his resilience, challenge his strategies, and reveal hidden pressures from those who had orchestrated his removal. And what came next would push Harry's emotional limits further than he could have imagined, exposing betrayals, loyalties, and pressures that no one outside the palace could foresee. The moment the news broke that Prince Harry had been removed from the line of succession, the world reacted. Not with measured analysis, but with shock, speculation, and frenzy. Overnight, the story became headline news in every major media outlet, from the United Kingdom to the United States, Europe, Asia, and beyond.